Chapter 18. They had a very pleasant walk, with a great deal of sitting down in warm, time-fragrant corners. And if anything could have helped Rose to recover from the bitter disappointment of the morning, it would have been the company and conversation recover. And the same process took place as that which Lotty had undergone with her husband. And the more Mr. Briggs thought Rose charming, the more charming she became. Briggs was a man incapable of concealments, who never lost time if he could help it. They had of the headland, where the lighthouse is. Briggs asked her to show him the lighthouse, because the path to it, he knew, was wide enough for two to walk abreast and fairly level. Before he had told her of the impression she had made on him in London. Sober women like to know they have made an impression, particularly the kind that has nothing to do with character or merits. Rose was pleased. Being pleased, she smiled. Smiling, she was more attractive than ever. And brightness into her eyes. She heard herself saying things that really sounded quite interesting and even amusing. If Frederick were listening now, she thought perhaps he would see that she couldn't, after all, be such a hopeless bore. She couldn't, after all, be such a hopeless bore. For here was a man, nice-looking, young, and surely clever. He seemed clever, and she hoped he was, for then the compliment would be still greater. Who was evidently quite happy, would be still greater. Who was evidently quite happy to spend the afternoon just talking to her. And indeed, Mr. Briggs seemed very much interested. He wanted to hear all about everything she had been doing from the moment she got there. He asked her if she had seen this from the moment she got there. He asked her if she had seen this, that, and the other in the house, what she liked best, which room she had if she were comfortable, if Francesca was behaving, if Domenico took care of her, and whether she didn't enjoy using the yellow sitting room, the one that got all the sun, and looked out towards Genoa. Rose was ashamed how little she'd noticed in the house, and how few of the things he spoke of as curious or beautiful in it she had even seen. Swamped in thoughts of Frederick, she appeared to have lived in San Salvatore, and what had been the good of it? She might just as well have been sitting hankering on Hampstead Heath. No, she mightn't. Through all her hankerings, she had been conscious that she was at least in the beauty, this longing to share it, that had first started her off, hankering. Mr. Briggs, however, was too much alive for her to be able to spare any attention at this moment for Frederick. And she praised the servants in answer to his questions. And him, she had only been in it once, and then was ignominiously ejected. And she told him she knew hardly anything about art and curiosities, but thought perhaps if somebody would tell her about them, she would know more. And she had spent every day since her arrival out of doors, because out of doors there was so very wonderful and different from anything she had ever seen. Briggs walked by her side along his paths that were yet so happily for the moment her paths, and felt the innocent glows of family life. He was an orphan and an only child, and had a warm domestic disposition. He would have adored a sister and spoiled a mother. He would have adored a sister and spoiled a mother, and was beginning at this time to think of marrying. For though he had been very happy with his various loves, each of whom, contrary to the usual experience, turned ultimately into his devoted friend, He was fond of children and turned ultimately into his devoted friend. He was fond of children and thought he had perhaps now got to the age of settling if he did not wish to be too old by the time his eldest son was 20. San Salvatore had latterly seemed a little forlorn. He fancied it echoed, then he walked about it. Then he walked about it. He had felt lonely there. So lonely that he had preferred this year to miss out a spring and let it. It wanted a wife in it, and it wanted that final touch of warmth and beauty, for he never thought of his wife except in terms of be beautiful and kind. It amused him how much in love with his vague wife he was already. At such a rate was he making friends with a lady with the sweet name as he walked along the path towards the lighthouse, that he was sure presently he would be telling her everything about himself and his past doing, and the thought of such a swiftly developing confidence made him laugh. "Why are you laughing?" she asked, looking at him and smiling. "It's so like coming home," he said. "But it is coming home for you to come here. I mean, really, like coming home. I never had a family. I'm an orphan." "Oh, are you?" said Rose with the proper sympathy. "I hope you've not been one very long." "No. I mean, I hope you have been one very long." "No, I don't know what I mean, except that I'm sorry." He laughed again. "Oh, I'm used to it. I haven't anybody. No sisters or brothers. Then you're an only child," she observed intelligently. "Only child," she observed intelligently. "Yes. And there's something about you that's exactly my idea of a family." She was amused. "So cozy," he said, looking at her. He said, looking at her and searching for a word. "You wouldn't think so if you saw my house in Hampstead." She said a vision of that austere and hard-seated dwelling presenting itself to her mind, with nothing soft in it except the shunned and neglected Dubarry's sofa. No wonder, she thought, for a moment, fear-brained, that Frederick avoided it. There was nothing cozy about his family. "I don't believe any place you lived in anything but exactly like you," he said. "You're not going to pretend San Salvatore is like me?" "Indeed, I do pretend it." "Surely you admit that it is beautiful." He said several things like that. She enjoyed her walk. Since her courting days, she came back to tea, bringing Mr. Briggs, and looking quite different, Mr. Wilkins noticed, from what she had looked till then. Trouble here, thought Mr. Wilkins, mentally rubbing his professional hand, presently to advise. On the one hand, there was Arbuthnot. On the other hand, here was Briggs. Trouble brewing, trouble sooner or later. But why had Briggs's telegram pale from excess of joy? Then trouble was nearer than he had supposed. She was not pale now. She was more like her name than he had yet seen her. Well, he was the man for trouble. He regretted, of course, that people should get into it, but being in, he was their man. These thoughts, his career being very precious to him, proceeded to assist in doing the honors to Mr. Briggs, both in his quality of sharer in the temporary ownership of San Salvatore, and of probable helper out of difficulties with great hospitality, and pointed out the various features to the parapet, and showed him Mezzago across the bay. Mrs. Fisher, too, was gracious. This was this young man's house. He was a man of property. She liked property. and she liked men of property. In being a man of property so young, inheritance, of course. An inheritance was more respectable than acquisition. It did indicate fathers, and in an age where most people appeared neither to have them, nor to want them, she liked this too. With everybody amiable and pleased. Briggs thought Mrs. Fisher a dear old lady, and showed he thought so. And again the magic worked, and she became a dear old lady. She developed benignity with him, and benignity with him, and a kind of benignity which was almost playful. Actually, before tea was over, including in some observation, she made him the words, "My dear boy," strange the words, "My dear boy," strange words in Mrs. Fisher's mouth. It is doubtful whether in her life she had used them before. Rose was astonished how nice people really were. How nice people really were. When would she leave off making mistakes about them? She hadn't suspected this side of Mrs. Fisher, and she began to wonder whether those other sides of her, with which alone she was acquainted, had not perhaps, after all, been the effect of her own militant and irritating behavior. Probably they were. How horrid, then, she must have been. He felt very penitent when she saw Mrs. Fisher beneath her eyes blossoming out into real amiability the moment someone came along who was charming to her. And she could have sunk into the ground with shame when Mrs. Fisher presently laughed. And she realized by the shock it gave her that the sound was entirely new. Not once before had she or anyone else there heard Mrs. Fisher laugh. What an indictment of the lot of them. For they had all laughed, the others, some more and some less, at one time or another since their arrival, and only Mrs. Fisher had not. Clearly, since she could enjoy herself as she was now enjoying herself, she had not enjoyed herself before. Nobody had cared whether she did or not, except perhaps Lotty. Yes, but Lotty seemed to produce a bad effect on Mrs. Fisher, while as for Rose herself, she had never been with her for 5 minutes without really wanting, to provoke and oppose her. How very horrid she had been. She had behaved unpardonably in deferential solicitude towards Mrs. Fisher, which made the observant Briggs think her still more angelic, and wish for a moment that he were an old lady himself in order to be behaved to by Rose Arbuthnot, just like that. There was evidently, he would even not mind taking medicine, really nasty medicine, if it were Rose Arbuthnot bending over him with the dose. She felt his bright blue eyes, the brighter because he was so sunburned, fixed on her with a twinkle in them, and smiling asked him what he was thinking about. But he couldn't very well tell, and added Sunday. Trouble, thought Mr. Wilkins at this, then, mentally rubbing his hands. Well, I'm their man. I'm sure, said Mrs. Fisher benignly, you have no thoughts we may not hear. I'm sure you have no thoughts we may not hear. I'm sure, said Briggs, I will be telling you every one of my secrets in a week. You would be telling somebody very safe, then, said Mrs. Fisher, benevolently. Said Mrs. Fisher, benevolently. Just such a son would she have liked to have had. And in return, she went on, I dare say I would tell you mine. Ah, no, said Mr. Wilkins, adapting himself to this tone, said Mr. Wilkins, adapting himself to this tone of easy badinage. I must protest. I really must. I have a prior claim. I am the older friend. I have known Mrs. Fisher 10 days, and you, Briggs, have not yet known. I assert my right to be told her secrets first. That is, he added, bowing gallantly, if she has any, which I beg leave to doubt. Oh, haven't I? Exclaimed Mrs. Fisher, thinking of those green leaves. That she should exclaim at all, we shall worm them out, said Briggs, with equal gaiety. They won't need much worming out, said Mrs. Fisher. My difficulty is to keep them from bursting out. It might have been Lotty talking. Mr. Wilkins adjusted the single eyeglass he carried with him for occasions and used, though Rose did not quite know why. And her smile was a little uncertain, for Mrs. Fisher amused was a new sight, not without its awe-inspiring aspects, and had to be accustomed to. What Mrs. Fisher was thinking, they would think she was an extremely silly old woman, and so would she have thought as lately as 2 days ago. But the bud idea was becoming familiar to her. She was more apprivoisée now, as dear Matthew Arnold used to say. And though it would undoubtedly be matched, yet supposing they did not, and one couldn't have everything, was it not better to feel young somewhere rather than old everywhere? Time enough to be old everywhere again, inside as well as out, when she got back to her inside as well as out, when she got back to her sarcophagus in Prince of Wales Terrace. Yet it is probable that without the arrival of Briggs, Mrs. Fisher would have gone on secretly fermenting in her shell. The others only knew her as severe, fermenting in her shell. The others only knew her as severe. It would have been more than her dignity could bear suddenly to relax, especially towards the 3 young women. But now came the stranger Briggs, a stranger who at once took to her as no young man had taken to her in her life. And it was the coming of Briggs, and his real and manifest appreciation. For just such a grandmother, thought Briggs, hungry for home life, and its concomitants would he have liked to have. That released Mrs. Fisher from her shell. And here she was, at last, as Lotty had predicted, pleased, good, humored, and benevolent. Lotty, coming back half an hour late up garden in the hope of still finding tea, saw at once what had happened, for Mrs. Fisher at that very moment was laughing. She's burst her cocoon, thought Lotty, and swift as she was in all her movements, and impulsive, and also without any sense of propriety of Mrs. Fisher's chair, and kissed her. Good gracious, cried Mrs. Fisher, starting violently, for such a thing had not happened to her since Mr. Fisher's earlier days, and then only gingerly. This kiss was a real kiss, and rested on Mrs. Fisher's cheek soft sweetness. When she saw whose it was, a deep flush spread over her face. Mrs. Wilkins kissing her, and the kiss feeling so affectionate. Even if she had wanted to, she could not in the presence of the appreciative Mr. Briggs resume her cast-off severity, and begin rebuking again. But she did not want to. Was it possible Mrs. Wilkins had liked her all this time, while she had been so much disliking her herself? A queer little trickle of warmth filtered to the frozen defenses. A queer little trickle of warmth filtered to the frozen defenses of Mrs. Fisher's heart. Somebody young kissing her. Somebody young wanting to kiss her. Very much flushed, she watched the strange creature, apparently quite unconscious she had done anything extraordinary, shaking hands with Mr. Briggs on her husband's introducing him, and immediately embarking on the friendliest conversation with him, exactly as if she had known him all her life. What a strange creature! What a very strange creature! It was natural, she being so strange, that one should have perhaps misjudged her. "I'm sure you want some tea," said Briggs, with eager hospitality to Lotty. He thought her delightful, freckles, picnic untidiness and all. Just such a sister would he. Just such a sister would he. "This is cold," he said, filling the teapot. "I'll tell Francesca to make you some fresh." He broke off and blushed. "Aren't I forgetting myself?" he said, laughing and looking round at them. Very natural, Mr. Wilkins reassured him. "I'll go and tell Francesca," said Rose, getting up. No, said Briggs. "Don't go away." And he put his hands to his mouth and shouted. "Francesca," shouted Briggs. She came running. "No," with such celerity. "Her master's voice," remarked Mr. Wilkins. Aptly, he considered. "Make fresh tea," ordered Briggs in Italian. Quick, quick. And then remembering himself, he blushed again, and begged everybody's pardon. Natural. Mr. Wilkins reassured him. Briggs then explained to Lotty what he had explained twice already, once to Rose, and once to the other two, that he was on his way to Rome, and thought he would get out of the boat and continue his journey the next day, staying the night in a hotel at Messigo. "But how ridiculous," said Lotty. "Of course you must stay here. It's your house. There's Kate Lumley's room," she added, turning to Mrs. Fisher. "Emily isn't in it, you know," she said, turning to Briggs again and laughing. And Mrs. Fisher, to her immense surprise, laughed too. She knew that at any other time this remark would have struck her as excessively unseemly, and yet now she assured Briggs Kate Lumley was not in that room. Very fortunately, for she was an excessively wide person, and the room was excessively narrow. Kate Lumley might get into it, but that was about all. Once in, she would fit it so tightly to get out again. It was entirely at Mr. Briggs's disposal, and she hoped he would do nothing so absurd as go to an hotel. The whole place. Rose listened to this speech, wide-eyed with amazement. Lotty laughed very much too, and at the end of it bent down and kissed her again. Kissed her several times. "So you see, my dear boy," said Mrs. Fisher, "you must stay here and give us all a great deal of pleasure." "A great deal indeed," heartily. "A very great deal," repeated Mrs. Fisher, looking exactly like a pleased mother. "Do," said Rose, on Briggs's turning inquiringly to her. How kind of you all, he said, his face broad with kind of you all, he said, his face broad with smiles. I'd love to be a guest here. What a new sensation. And with 3. Such. He broke off and looked round. I say, he asked. Looked round. I say, he asked. Died to have her 4th hostess. Francesca said she had 4 mistresses. Yes. There's Lady Caroline, said Lottie. Then, hadn't we better find out first if she invites me? Then, hadn't we better find out first if she invites me to? Oh, but she's sure, began. The daughter of the Droitwiches Briggs, said Mr. Wilkins, is not likely to be wanting in the proper hospitable impulses. The daughter of the, repeated Briggs, but he stopped dead, for there, in the doorway, was the daughter of the Droitwiches herself, or rather, coming towards him out of the dark doorway into the brightness of the sunset, was that which he had, his ideal of absolute loveliness. Chapter 19. And then when she spoke, what chance was there for poor Briggs? He was undone. All Scrap said was, "How do you do?" on Mr. Wilkins presenting him, but it was enough. That undid happy young man, overflowing with life and feminineness, he became silent, solemn, and with little beads on his temples. Also, he became clumsy, dropping the teaspoon as he handed her her cup, mismanaging the macaroons. Could not keep off the enchanting face for a moment. And when Mr. Wilkins, elucidating him, for he failed to elucidate himself, informed Lady Caroline that in Mr. Briggs she beheld the owner of San Salvatore, who was on his way to Rome, but had got out at Messago, etc., and that the other 3 ladies had invited him to spend the night in what was to all intents and purposes his own house rather than an hotel. And Mr. Briggs was only waiting for the seal of her approval to this invitation, she being the 4th hostess. When Mr. Wilkins' invitation, she being the 4th hostess. When Mr. Wilkins, balancing his sentences and being admirably clear and enjoying the sound of his own cultured voice, explained the position in this manner to Lady Caroline, Briggs sat and said never a word. A deep melancholy invaded Scrap. Sat and said never a word. A deep melancholy invaded Scrap. The symptoms of the incipient grabber were all there and only too familiar, and she knew that if Briggs stayed her rest cure might be regarded as over. Then Kate Lumley occurred to her. She caught at was over. Then Kate Lumley occurred to her. She caught at Kate as at a straw. It would have been delightful, she said, faintly smiling at Briggs. She cannot, in decency, not smile, at least a little. But even a little betrayed the dimple, and Briggs's eyes became more fixed than ever. I'm only wondering if there is room. Yes, there is, said Lottie. There's Kate Lumley's room. I thought, said Scraps, to Mrs. Fisher, and it seemed friend was expected immediately. Oh no, said Mrs. Fisher, with an odd placidness Scrap thought. Miss Lumley, said Mr. Wilkins. Who should I? He inquired of Mrs. Fisher. Nobody has ever married Kate, said Mrs. Fisher complacently. Quite so. Miss Lady Caroline, and Mr. Briggs has, unfortunately, if I may say so, to continue his journey to Morro, so that his staying would in no way interfere with Miss Lumley's possible movements. Then, of course, I join in the invitation, said Scrap. With what was to Briggs, stammered something, flushing scarlet, and Scrap thought, oh, and turned her head away. But that nearly made Briggs acquainted with her profile, And if there existed anything more lovely than Scrap's full face, it was her profile. Well, it was only for this one afternoon and evening. He would leave, no doubt, the first thing in the morning. It took hours to get to Rome. Awful if he hung on till the night train. She had a feeling that the principal express to Rome passed through at night. Why hadn't that woman, Kate Lumley, arrived yet? She had forgotten all about her, but now she remembered she was to have been invited a fortnight ago. What had become of her? This man, once let in, would come and see her in London, would haunt the places she was likely to go to. He had the makings. Her experienced eye could see of a passionately persistent grabber. If Mr. Wilkins, observing Briggs's face and sudden silence, any understanding exists in nature from the kind I feared, in which Arbuthnot would have played a leading part, in fact the part of petitioner, the trouble that may need help and advice none the less for its not being publicly scandalous. Briggs, impelled by his passions and her beauty, will aspire to the daughter of the Droitwiches, and show it. Arbuthnot, on his arrival, will find his wife in enigmatic tears. Inquiring into their cause, he will be met with an icy reserve. More trouble may then be expected, and in me they will seek eggs, and it looks uncommonly as if she were not going to get him. Well, I'm mere man. Where are your things, Mr. Briggs? Asked Mrs. Fisher, her voice round with motherliness. Oughtn't they to be fetched? For the sun was nearly in the... Briggs started. My things, he repeated. Oh yeah, I must fetch them. They're in Mezzago. I'll send Domenico. My fly is waiting in the village. He can go back in it. I'll go and tell him. He got up. To whom was he talking? To Mrs. Fisher, ostensibly. Yet his eyes were fixed on Scrap. He said nothing, and looked at no one. Then, recollecting himself, he stammered, I'm awfully sorry. I keep on forgetting. I'll go down and fetch them. Myself. We can easily send Domenico, said Rose. And at her gentle voice, he turned his head. Why, there was his friend, the sweet-named lady. But how had she not, in this short interval, changed? Was it the failing light making her so colorless, so vague-featured, so dim, so much like a ghost? A nice good ghost, of course, and still with a pretty name, but only a ghost. We turned from her to Scrap again, and forgot Rose Arbuthnot's existence. How is it possible for him to bother about anybody or anything else in this first moment of being face to face with his dream come true? Briggs had not supposed or hoped that anyone as beautiful as his dream of beauty existed. He had never till now met even an approximation. Pretty women, charming women by the score he had met and properly appreciated, but never the godlike thing itself. He used to think If ever I saw a perfectly beautiful woman, I should die. And though having now met what to his ideas was a perfectly beautiful woman, he did not die. He became very nearly as incapable of managing his own affairs as if he had. The others were obliged to arrange everything for him. By questions, they extracted from the cloakroom at Mazzaga. They sent for Domenico, and urged and prompted by everybody except Scrap, who sat in silence and looked at no one. Briggs was induced to give him the necessary instructions for going back in the fly. To see the collapse of Briggs, everybody noticed it.
Even Rosé.
Upon my word, thought Mrs. Fisher, the way one pretty face can turn a delightful man into an idiot is past all patience. And feeling the air getting chilly and the sun to order his room to be got ready, regretting now that she had pressed the poor boy to stay. She had forgotten Lady Caroline's killjoy face for the moment, and the more completely owing to the absence of any ill effects produced by it on Mr. Wilkins. Poor boy. Such a charming boy, left to himself. It was true she could not accuse Lady Caroline of not leaving him to himself, for she was taking no notice of him at all. But that did not help. Exactly like foolish moths did men, in other respects, intelligent flutter round the men. In other respects, intelligent flutter round the impassive Lady Campbell of a pretty face. She had seen them doing it. She had looked on only too often. Almost she laid a motherly hand on Briggs' fair head as she passed him. Poor hand on Briggs' fair head as she passed him. Poor boy. Then Scrap, having finished her cigarette, got up and went indoors too. She saw no reason why she should sit there in order to gratify Mr. Briggs's desire to stare. She would have liked to stay out longer, to go to her corner behind the daphne bushes and look at the sunset sky and watch the lights coming out one by one in the village below and smell the sweet moistness of the evening. But if she did, Mr. Briggs would certainly... The old familiar tyranny had begun again. Her holiday of peace and liberation was interrupted, perhaps over, for who knew if he would go away, after all, tomorrow. He might leave the house, driven out of it by his taking rooms in the village and coming up every day. This tyranny of one person over another. And she was so miserably constructed that she wouldn't even be able to kind of frown him down without being misunderstood. Scrap felt indignant with Mr. Briggs, who was doing her out of it. And she turned her back on the garden and him and went towards the house without a look or a word. But Briggs, when he realized her intention, leapt to his feet, snatched chairs not in her path on one side, hurried to the door, which stood wide open in order to hold it open, and followed her through it, walking by her side along the hall. What was to be done with Mr. Briggs? Well, it was his hole. She couldn't prevent his walking along it. I hope, he said, not yet able while walking to take his eyes off her, so that he knocked against several things he would otherwise have avoided. The corner of a bookcase, an ancient carved cupboard, the table with the flowers on it, shaking the water over. That you are quite comfortable here. If you're not, I'll flay them alive. His voice vibrated. What was to be done with Mr. Briggs? She could, of course, stay in her room the whole time, say she was ill, not appear at dinner. But again, the tyranny of this. I'm very comfortable indeed, said Scrap. If I had dreamed you were coming, he began. That's a wonderful old place, said Scrap, doing her utmost to sound. Place, said Scrap, doing her utmost to sound detached and forbidding, but with little hope of success. The kitchen was on this floor, and passing its door, which was open a crack, they were observed by the servants, whose thoughts, communicated to each other by looks, may be roughly reproduced by such rude symbols as aha and oho, symbols which represented and included their appreciation of the inevitable, their foreknowledge of the inevitable, and their complete understanding and approval. Briggs, as she paused at the foot of them. Yes. Which room do you sit in? The drawing room or the small yellow room? In my own room. So then he couldn't go up with her. So then all he could do was to wait till she came out again. It thrilled him to hear her call any room in his house her own room, that he might picture her in it. He longed to know if by any happy chance it was his room, forever after to be filled with her wonder. But he didn't dare, Francesca, anybody. Then I shan't see you again till dinner? Dinner is at 8, was Scrap's evasive answer as she went upstairs. He watched her go. She passed the Madonna, the Porch of the Rose Arbuthnot, and the dark and pale to shrivel into insignificance as she passed. She turned the bend of the stairs in the setting sun, shining through the west window, a moment on her face, turned her to glory. She disappeared, and the sun went out too, and the stairs were silent, trying to tell from the sound of the shutting door which room she had gone into, and wandered aimlessly away through the hall again, and found himself back in the top garden. Scrap from her window saw him there. She saw Lotty and Rose sitting on the end parapet, where she would have liked to have buttonholing Briggs, and evidently telling him the story of the oleander tree in the middle of the garden. Briggs was listening with a patience she thought rather nice, seeing that it was his oleander and his own father's story. She knew the story by his gestures. Domenico had told it her soon after her arrival, and he had also told Mrs. Fisher, who had told Mr. Wilkins. Mrs. Fisher thought highly of this story, and often spoke of it. It was about a cherry, and often spoke of it. It was about a cherrywood walking stick. Briggs's father had thrust this stick into the ground at that spot, and said to Domenico's father, who was then the gardener, "Here we will have an oleander. Here we will have an oleander." And Briggs's father left the stick in the ground as a reminder to Domenico's father. And it presently, how long afterwards, nobody remembered. And this nobody remembered. And the stick began to sprout, and it was an oleander. There stood poor Mr. Briggs being told all about it, and listening to the story he must have known from infancy with Patience. Probably he was thinking of something infancy with Patience. Probably he was thinking of something else. She was afraid he was. How unfortunate, how extremely unfortunate, the determination that seized people to get hold of and engulf other people. If only they could be induced to stand. Mr. Briggs be more like Lotty, who never wanted anything of anybody, but was complete in herself and respected other people's completeness. One loved being with Lotty. With her one was free, and yet befriended. Mr. Briggs looked so really nice too. She thought she might like. Scrap felt melancholy. Here she was shut up in her bedroom, which was stuffy from the afternoon sun that had been pouring into it instead of out in the cool garden. And all because of Mr. Briggs. Intolerable tyranny, she thought. Endure it. She would go out all the same. She would run downstairs while Mr. Wilkins, really that man was a treasure, held Mr. Briggs down, telling him about the oleander, and get out of the house by the front door and take cover in the shadow. Could see her there.
Nobody would think of looking for her there.
She snatched up a wrap, for she did not mean to come back for a long while, perhaps not even to dinner. It would be all Mr. Briggs's fault if she went dinnerless and hungry. Briggs's fault if she went dinnerless and hungry. And with another glance out of the window to see if she were still safe, she stole out and got away to the sheltering trees of the zigzag path, and there sat down on one of the seats placed at each bend, and there sat down on one of the seats placed at each bend, to assist the upward journey of those who were breathless. Ah, this was lovely, thought Scrap with a sigh of relief. How cool. How good it smelt. How cool. How good it smelt. She could see the quiet water of the little harbor through the pine trunks, and the lights coming out in the houses on the other side. And all round her, the green dusk was splashed by the rose pink of the gladioluses in the grass, and the white of the crowding daisies. Ah, this was lovely. So still, nothing moving, not a leaf, not a stalk. The only sound was a dog bark, or when the door of the little restaurant in the piazza below was opened, and there was a burst of voices, silenced again immediately by the swinging to of the door. She drew in a deep breath of pleasure. Ah, this was... What was that? She leaned forward, listening, her body tense. Footsteps on the zigzag path. Briggs, finding her out. Should she run? No. The footsteps were coming up, no, from the village. Perhaps Angela with provisions. She relapsed again. But the steps were not the steps of Angela, that swift and springy youth. They were slow and considered, and they kept, thought Scrap. The idea of going back to the house did not occur to her. She was afraid of nothing in life, except love. Brigands or murderers, as such, held no terrors for the daughter of the Droitwiches. They left off being brigands and murderers, and began instead to try and make love. The next moment, the footsteps turned the corner of her bit of path and stood still. Get in his wind, thought Scrap. Not like she took them to belong to a man. Then, as he did not move, she turned her head and beheld with astonishment a person she had seen a good deal of lately in London, the well-known writer of amusing memoirs, Mr. Ferdinand Arundel. Way of being followed surprised her any more, but that he should have discovered where she was surprised her. Her mother had promised faithfully to tell no one. You? She said, feeling betrayed. Here. He came up to her hat. His forehead beneath the hat was wet with the beads of unaccustomed crying. He looked ashamed and entreating, like a guilty but devoted dog. You must forgive me, he said. Lady Droitwich told us to forgive me, he said. Lady Droitwich told me where you were. and as I happened to be passing through on my way to Rome, I thought I would get out at Mezzago and just look in and see how you were. But didn't my mother tell you that I was doing a rest cure? Yes. Didn't my mother tell you that I was doing a rest cure? Yes. She did. And that's why I haven't intruded on you earlier in the day. I thought you would probably sleep all day and wake up about now so as to be fed. But I know. I've got nothing to say in excuse. I couldn't help myself.
This, thought Scrap, comes of mother insisting on having authors to lunch, and me being so much more amiable in appearance than I really am.
She had been amiable to Ferdinand Arundel. She liked him, or rather, she did not dislike him. He seemed a jovial, simple man and had the eyes of a nice dog. Also, though it was evident there, he had merely been a good-natured, harmless person of entertaining conversation, who helped to make luncheons agreeable. Now it appeared that he too was a grabber. Fancy following her out there, daring too. Nobody else had, because she considered him so absolutely harmless, and thought he might be useful and see her home. Well, whatever he was, he couldn't possibly give her the trouble. An active young man like Mr. Briggs might give her. Mr. Briggs, she felt, would stick at nothing, would lose his head publicly. She could imagine Mr. Briggs doing things with rope ladders and singing all night under her window, being really difficult and uncomfortable. Mr. Arundel hadn't the figure for any kind of recklessness. He had lived too long and too well. She was sure he couldn't sing and wouldn't want to. He must be at least 40. How many good dinners could not a man have eaten by the time he was 40? And if during that time, instead of taking exercise, he had sat writing books, he would quite naturally acquire the figure Mr. Arundel had in fact acquired, the figure rather for conversation than adventure. Scrap, who had become melancholy at the sight of Briggs, became philosophical at the sight of Arundel. Here he was. She couldn't send him away till after dinner. He must to be nourished. This being so, she had better make the best of it, and do that with a good grace, which anyhow wasn't to be avoided. Besides, he would be a temporary shelter from Mr. Briggs. She was at least acquainted with Ferdinand Arundel, and could hear news from him, of her mother and her friends, and such talk would put up a defensive barrier at dinner, between herself and the approaches of the other one. And it was only for one dinner, and he couldn't ache her. She therefore prepared herself for friendliness. I'm to be fed, she said, ignoring his last remark, at 8, and you must come up and be fed too. Sit down and get cool, and tell me how everybody is. May I really dine with you? In these traveling things, he said, wiping his forehead before sitting down beside her. She was too lovely to be true, he thought. Just to hear her voice was enough reward for his journey and his fears. Of course. I suppose you've left your fly in the village, and will be going on from Mexico by the night train, or stay in Mexico in an hotel. But tell me, he said, gazing at the adorable profile, about yourself. London has been extraordinarily dull and empty. Lady Droitwich said you were with people here? She didn't know. I hope they've been kind to you? Thing a cure should. They've been very kind, said Scrap. I got them out of an advertisement. An advertisement? It's a good way, I find, to get friends. And fonder of one of these than I'd been of anybody. You shall guess which of them it is when you see them. Tell me about Mother. When did you see her last? We arranged not to write to each other unless there was something special. I wanted to have a month that was perfectly blank. I can't tell you how ashamed I am, both of having done it and of not having been able to help it. Oh, but, said Scrap quickly, for he could not have come on a better day, when up there waiting and watching for her was, she knew, the enamored Briggs. I'm really... Chapter 20. Scrap wanted to know so much about her mother that Arundel had presently to him. He would talk about anything she wished, if only he might be with her for a while, and see her, and hear her. But he knew very little of the Droitwiches and their friends. Bigger functions where literature is also represented, and in using them at luncheons and dinners, he knew very little of them really. To them, he had always remained Mr. Arundel. No one called him Ferdinand. And he only knew the gossip also available to the... But he was, however, good at inventing. And as soon as he had come to an end of first-hand knowledge, in order to answer her inquiries and keep her there to himself, he proceeded to invent. It was quite easy to fasten some of the entertaining people and pretend they were theirs. Scrap, who had that affection for her parents, which warms in absence, was athirst for news, and became more and more interested by the news he gradually imparted. At first, it was ordinary news. He had met her. She looked very well. She said so and so. But presently, the things Lady Droitwich had said took on an unusual quality. They became amusing. Mother said that. Scrap interrupted. Amusing things, as well as say them. Mother did that? Scrap inquired, wide-eyed. Arundel warmed to his work. He fathered some of the most entertaining ideas he had lately had on to Lady Droitwich, and also any charming funny thing, for he could imagine almost anything. Scrap's eyes grew round with wonder and affectionate pride in her mother. Why? But how funny. Fancy Mother. What an old darling. Did she really do that? How perfectly adorable of her. Did she really do that? How perfectly adorable of her. And did she really say, but how wonderful of her to think of it. What sort of a face did Lloyd George make? She laughed and laughed, and had a great longing, laughed and laughed, and had a great longing to hug her mother, and the time flew, and it grew quite dusk, and it grew nearly dark. And Mr. Arundel still went on amusing her, and it was 7:45 before she suddenly remembered dinner. And it was 7:45 before she suddenly remembered dinner. Oh, good heavens, she exclaimed, jumping up. Yes. It's late, said Arundel. I'll go on quickly and send the maid to you. I'm a flun. And send the maid to you. I'm a flun. or I'll never be ready in time. And she was gone up the path with the swiftness of a young, slender deer. Arundel followed. He did not wish to arrive too hot, so had to go slow. He did not wish to arrive too hot, so had to go slowly. Fortunately, he was near the town, and Francesca came down the pergola to pilot him indoors. And having shown him where he could wash, she put him in the empty drawing room to cool himself. She put him in the empty drawing room to cool himself by the crackling wood fire. He got as far away from the fire as he could, and stood in one of the deep window recesses, looking out at the distant lights of Mazzedo. The drawing room door was open, and the house of Mazzedo. The drawing room door was open, and the house was quiet, with the hush that precedes dinner, when the inhabitants are all shut up in their rooms dressing. Briggs, overwhelmed in his room, was throwing away spoil. Scrap in hers was hurrying into a black frock, with a vague notion that Mr. Briggs wouldn't be able to see her so clearly in black. Mrs. Fisher was fastening the lace shawl, which nightly transformed her day dress into her evening dress, with the brooch formed of 2 pearl lilies tied together by a blue enamel ribbon, on which was written in gold letters Esto Perpetua. Mr. Wilkins was sitting on the edge of his bed, brushing his wife's hair. Thus far in this 3rd week had he progressed in demonstrativeness. On a chair in front of him, put his studs in a clean shirt, and Rose, ready dressed, sat at her window considering her day. Rose was quite aware of what had happened to Mr. Briggs. If she had had any difficulty about it, Lotty would have sat together after tea on the wall. Lotty was delighted at more love being introduced into San Salvatore, even if it were only one-sided, and said that when once Rose's husband was there, she didn't suppose, now that Mrs. Fisher too had at last come unglued. Rose protested at the expression, and Lottie retorted that it was in Keats. There would be another place in the world, more swarming with happiness than San Salvatore. Your husband, said Lottie, swinging her feet, might be here quite soon, perhaps tomorrow evening if he starts at once. And there'll be a glorious final few days before we all go home refreshed for life. I don't believe any of us will ever be the same again. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Caroline doesn't end by getting fond of the young man Briggs. It's in the air. You have to get fond of people here. Rose sat at her window thinking of these things. Lottie's optimism. Yet it had been justified by Mr. Wilkins. And look, too, at Mrs. Fisher. If only would come true as well about Frederick. For Rose, between tea and dinner, thinking of him harder than ever. It had been funny and delightful, that little interlude of admiration. But of course, it couldn't go on once Caroline appeared. Rose knew her place. She could see, as well as any one, made one feel how capable of really deserving them, how different, how glowing. They seemed to quicken unsuspected faculties into life. She was sure she had been a thoroughly amusing woman between lunch and 2, and a pretty one, too. She thought she had been like a torpid fly, brought back to gay buzzin' by the lighting of a fire in a wintry room. She still buzzed, she still tingled.
Just at the remembrance.
What fun it had been, alive. Although it was all over, she still glowed with it and felt more exhilarated, more optimistic, more as Lottie probably constantly felt, than she had done since she was a girl. She dressed with care, though she knew Mr. Briggs would no longer see her, but it gave her pleasure to see how pretty, while she was about it, she could make herself look. And very nearly, she stuck a crimson camellia in her hair down by her ear. She did hold it there for a minute, and it looked almost sinfully attractive, and was exactly the color of her mouth, that she took it out again with a smile and a sigh, and put it in the proper place for flowers, which is water. She mustn't be silly, she thought. Think of the poor. Soon she would be back with them, she thought. Think of the poor. Soon she would be back with them again. And what would a camellia behind her ears seem like then? Simply fantastic. But on one thing, she was determined. The first thing she would do when she got home would be to have it out. With Frederick. If he didn't come to San Salvatore, that is what she would do, the very first thing. Long ago she ought to have done this, but always she had been handicapped when she tried to, by being so dreadfully fond of him, and so much afraid that fresh wounds were going to be given her wretched, soft heart. But now, let him wound her as much as he chose, as much as he possibly could. She would still have it out with him. Not that he ever intentionally wounded her. She knew he never meant to. She knew he often had no idea he never meant to. She knew he often had no idea of having done it. For a person who wrote books, fought, Rose, Frederick, didn't seem to have much imagination. Anyhow, she said to herself, getting up from the dressing table, things couldn't go on like this. She would have it out with him. This separate life, this freezing loneliness. She had had enough of it. Why shouldn't she too be happy? Matched her mood of rebelliousness. Shouldn't she too be loved and allowed to love? She looked at her little clock. Still 10 minutes before dinner. Tired of staying in her bedroom, she thought she would go on to Mrs. Fisher's battlements, which would be empty at this hour. She went into the deserted upper hall with this intention, but was attracted on her way along it by the firelight shining through the open door of the drawing room. How gay it looked! The fire transformed the room. A dark, ugly transformed by the warmth of. No, she wouldn't be silly. She could think of the poor. The thought of them always brought her down to sobriety at once. She peeped in. Firelight and flowers. And outside the deep slits of the night. How pretty. What a sweet place San Salvatore was. And that gorgeous lilac on the table. She must go and put her face in it. But she never got to the lilac. She went one step towards it, and then stood still, for she had seen the figure looking out of the window in the farthest corner, and it was Frederick. All the blood in Rose's body rushed to her heart. And seemed to stop its beating. Frederick, come. She stood quite still. He had not heard her. He did not turn round. She stood, looking at him. Turn round. She stood, looking at him. The miracle had happened and he had come. She stood holding her breath. So he needed her, for he had come instantly. So he, too, must have been thinking, longing. Her heart must have been thinking, longing. Her heart, which had seemed to stop beating, was suffocating her now, the way it raced along. Frederick did love her then. He must love her, or why had he come? Something, why had he come? Something, perhaps her absence, had made him turn to her, want her, and now the understanding she had made up her mind to have with him would be quite easy. Her thoughts wouldn't go would be quite easy. Her thoughts wouldn't go on. Her mind stammered. She couldn't think. She could only see and feel. She didn't know how it had happened. It was a miracle. God could do miracles. It was a miracle. God could do miracles. God had done this one. God could. Her mind stammered again, broke off. Frederick? She tried to say, but no sound came, or if it did, the crackling of the fire covered it up. She must go nearer. She began to creep towards him, softly, softly. He did not move. He had not heard. He heard nothing. She stopped a moment, unable to breathe. She was afraid. Suppose he. Oh, but he had come. He had come. She went on again, closer. And couldn't he feel? Didn't he know? Frederick. She whispered, hardly able even to whisper, choked by the beating of her heart. He spun round on his heels. Rose, he exclaimed, for her arms were round his neck, and her cheek was against his, and she was murmuring, her lips on his ear. I knew you would come. In my very heart, I always knew you would come. He was completely bewildered. Not only was his wife here, of all places in the world, but she was clinging to him as she had not clung for years, and murmuring love and welcoming him. If she welcomed him, she must have been expecting him. Strange, isn't it? That, and the softness of her cheek against his, and the long-forgotten sweet smell of her. Frederick was bewildered. But not being the man to hurt anything if he could help it, he too put his arms round her. And having put them round her, he also kissing her almost as tenderly as she was kissing him. And presently, he was kissing her quite as tenderly. And again, presently, he was kissing her more tenderly, and just as if he had never left off. Curiously natural to be doing it. It made him feel as if he were 30 again, instead of 40. And Rose were, his Rose of 20, the Rose he had so much adored before she began to weigh what he did with her idea of right. And the balance went against him, and she had turned strange and stony, and more shocked, and oh, so lamentable. He couldn't get at her in those days at all. She wouldn't at her in those days at all. She couldn't understand. She kept on referring everything to what she called God's eyes. In God's eyes, it couldn't be right. It wasn't right. Her miserable face, It wasn't right. Her miserable face, whatever her principals did for her, they didn't make her happy. Her little miserable face, twisted with effort to be patient, had then at last more than he could bear to see. And he had kept away as much as he could see. And he had kept away as much as he could. She never ought to have been the daughter of a low church rector. No, devil. She was quite unfitted to stand up against such an upbringing. What had happened? Why, she was his Rose again, past his comprehension. And meanwhile, and until such time as he understood, he still could kiss. In fact, he could not stop kissing, and it was he now who began to murmur, to say light, and tickled him, just as he remembered it used to tickle him. And as he held her close to his heart, and her arms were soft round his neck, he felt stealing over him a delicious sense of. At first, he didn't know what it was, this delicate, pervading warmth. Yes, security. No need now to be ashamed of his figure, and to make jokes about it, so as to forestall other people's, and show he didn't mind it. No need now to be ashamed of getting hot going up hills, where it appeared to beautiful young women. How middle-aged, how absurd in his inability to keep away from them. I mean, Rose cared nothing for such things. With her, he was safe. He was safe. To her, he was her lover, as he used to be. And she would never notice or mind any of the ignoble changes that getting older had made in him, and would go on making more and more. Frederick continued, therefore, and more. Frederick continued, therefore, with greater and greater warmth and growing delight, to kiss his wife, and the mere holding of her in his arms caused him to forget everything else. How could he, for instance, remember else? How could he, for instance, remember or think of Lady Caroline, to mention only one of the complications with which his situation bristled, when here was his sweet wife, miraculously restored to him, whispering with her cheek against his in the dear restored to him, whispering with her cheek against his in the dearest, most romantic words, how much she loved him, how terribly she had missed him. He did for one brief instant, for even in moments of love, there are brief instants of lucid thought. Recognize there are brief instants of lucid thought. Recognize the immense power of the woman present, and being actually held compared to that of the woman, however beautiful, who is somewhere else. But that is as far as somewhere else. But that is as far as he got towards remembering Scrap. No further. She was like a dream, fleeing before the morning light. When did you start? Murmured Rose, her mouth on his ear. Murmured Rose, her mouth on his ear. She couldn't let him go. Not even to talk. She couldn't let him go. Yesterday morning, murmured Frederick, holding her close. He couldn't let her go either. Holding her close. He couldn't let her go either. Oh, the very instant then, murmured Rose. This was cryptic, but Frederick said, yes, the very instant, and kissed her neck. How quickly my letter got to you, murmured Rose. Didn't it? Said Frederick, who felt like shutting his eyes himself. So there had been a letter. Soon, no doubt, light would be vouchsafed him. And meanwhile, this was so strangely, touchingly sweet, this holding his rose, but he couldn't bother to try to guess anything. Oh, he had been happy during these years, because it was not in him to be unhappy. Besides, how many interests life had had to offer him, how many friends, how much success, how to help him to blot out the thought of the altered, petrified, pitiful little wife at home who wouldn't spend his money, who was appalled by his books, who drifted away and away from him. And always, if he tried to have it out with her, asked him with hope and lived by, looked in the eyes of God. No one, she said once, should ever write a book God wouldn't like to read. That is the test, Frederick. And he had laughed hysterically, burst into a great shriek of laughter, and rushed out of the house. From her pathetic, solemn little face. But this Rose was his youth again. The best part of his life, the part of it that had had all the visions in it, and all the hopes. How they dreamed together, he and she, before he struck, and laughed, and loved. They had lived for a while in the very heart of poetry. After the happy days came the happy nights, the happy, happy nights, with her asleep close against his heart. With his heart. For they hardly moved in their deep, happy sleep. It was wonderful to have it all come back to him at the touch of her, at the feel of her face against his wonderful, that she should be able to give him back his youth. Overcome by remembrance, clinging to her now in his turn. Beloved husband, she breathed. The bliss of it. The sheer bliss. Briggs, coming in a few minutes before the gong went on, the chance that Lady Caroline might be there, was a widow, and he still supposed it, so that he was much astonished. Well, I'm damned, thought Briggs, quite clearly and distinctly, for the shock of what he saw in the window startled him so much that for a moment he was shaking free of his own confused absorption. Oh, I say, I beg your pardon, and then stood hesitating and wondering whether he oughtn't to go back to his bedroom again. If he had said nothing, they would not have noticed. He was there. But when he begged their pardon, to remember. And then Frederick looked at him without at first quite seeing him. They didn't seem, thought Briggs, to mind or to be at all embarrassed. He couldn't be her brother. No brother ever brought that look into us. It was very awkward. If they didn't mind, he did. It upset him to come across his Madonna forgetting herself. Is this one of your friends? Frederick was able, after an instant, to ask Rose, who made no attempt to introduce the young man standing awkwardly. Who made no attempt to introduce the young man standing awkwardly in front of them, but continued to gaze at him with a kind of abstracted, radiant goodwill. It's Mr. Briggs, said Rose, recognizing him. This is my husband, she added. Him. This is my husband, she added. And Briggs, shaking hands, just had time to think how surprising it was to have a husband when you were a widow before the gong sounded. And Lady Caroline would be there in a minute. And Lady Caroline would be there in a minute. And he ceased to be able to think at all, and merely became a thing, with its eyes fixed on the door. Through the door immediately entered, in what seemed to him an endless procession. First Mrs. Fisher seemed to him an endless procession. First Mrs. Fisher, very stately, in her evening lace shawl and brooch, who when she saw him at once relaxed into smiles and benignity, only to stiffen. However, when she caught sight of the stranger, then, when she caught sight of the stranger. Then, Mr. Wilkins, cleaner and neater and more carefully dressed and brushed than any man on earth. And then, tying something hurriedly as she came, Mrs. Wilkins. And then nobody. Lady Caroline was late. Where was she? Had she heard the gong? Oughtn't it to be beaten again? Suppose she didn't come to dinner after all. Briggs went cold. Introduce me, said Frederick on Mrs. Fisher's entrance, touching Rose's elbow. My husband, said Rose, holding him by the hand, her face exquisite. This, thought Mrs. Fisher, must now be the last of the husbands, unless Lady Caroline produces one from up her sleeve. But she received him graciously, for he certainly looked exactly like a husband, not at all like one of those people who go about abroad pretending they are husbands when they are not. And wife home at the end of the month, and remarked that now the house would be completely full. So that, she added, smiling at Briggs, we shall at last really be getting our money's worth. Briggs grinned automatically, because he was just able to, but he had not heard her, and he did not look at her. Not only were his eyes fixed on the door, but his whole body was concentrated on it. Introduced in his turn, Mr. Wilkins was most hospitable and called Frederick sir. Well, sir, here we are. And having gripped his hand with an understanding that only wasn't mutual, because Arbuthnot did not yet know what he was in for in the way of trouble, he looked at him as a man should, squarely in the eyes, and allowed his look to convey as plainly as the look that in him would be found staunchness, integrity, reliability, in fact, a friend in need. Mrs. Arbuthnot was very much flushed, Mr. Wilkins noticed. He had not seen her flushed like that before. Well, I'm the man, he thought. Lotty's greeting was effusive. It was done with both hands. Didn't I tell you? She laughed to Rose over her shoulder while Frederick was shaking her hands in both his. What did you tell her? Asked Frederick, in order to say something. The way they were all welcoming him was confusing. They had evidently all expected him, not only Rose. The sandy but agreeable young woman didn't answer his question, but looked extraordinarily pleased to see him. Why should she be extraordinarily pleased? Making the first remark that occurred to him. It's a tub of love, said the sandy young woman earnestly, which confused him more than ever. And his confusion became excessive at the next words he heard spoken these, by the old lady who said, Lady Caroline, and the thought of her confused him to excess. He went into the dining room like a man in a dream. He had come out to this place to see Lady Caroline, and had told her so. He had even told her in his fatuousness. Everybody in London thought his name was Arundel. He had used it and written under it so long that he almost thought it was himself. In the short time since she had left him on the sea in the garden, where he told her he had come because he couldn't help it, he had found Rose again had passionately, and then she was tired or bored and would not come to dinner at all. Then he could. Now he couldn't. He turned a deeper red even than usual, he being a man of full habit, and red anyhow, at the thought of such cowardice. No, he couldn't go away. No. He couldn't go away after dinner and catch his train and disappear to Rome. Not unless, that is, Rose came with him. But even so, what a running away. No, he couldn't. When they got to the dining room, he couldn't. When they got to the dining room, Mrs. Fisher went to the head of the table. Was this Mrs. Fisher's house? He asked himself. He didn't know. He didn't know anything. And Rose, who in her earlier days of defying Mrs. Fisher had taken the other end as her place. For after all, no one could say by looking at a table which was its top and which its bottom led Frederick to the seat next to her. If only, he thought, he could have been alone with Rose? If only, he thought, he could have been alone with Rose? Just 5 minutes more alone with Rose, so that he could have asked her. But probably he wouldn't have asked her anything, and only gone on kissing her. He looked round. The sandy young woman was telling the man they called Briggs to go and sit beside Mrs. Fisher. Was the house then the sandy young woman's and not Mrs. Fisher's? He didn't know. He didn't know anything. He didn't know. He didn't know anything. And she herself sat down on Rose's other side, so that she was opposite him, Frederick, and next to the genial man who had said, "Here we are, when it was only too evident. Here we are, when it was only too evident that there they were, indeed." Next to Frederick, and between him and Briggs, was an empty chair. Lady Caroline's. No more than Lady Caroline knew of the presence in Frederick's life of Rose. Was Rose aware of the presence in Frederick's life of Lady Caroline? What would each think? He didn't know. He didn't know anything. Yes, he did know something, and that was that his wife had made it up with him, unaccountably and divinely. Beyond that, he knew nothing. The situation was one with which he felt he could not cope. It must lead him whither it would. He could only drift. In silence, Frederick ate his soup, and the eyes, the large expressive eyes, could feel with a growing look in them of inquiry. They were, he could see, very intelligent and attractive eyes, and full, apart from the inquiry of goodwill. Probably she thought he ought to talk, but if she knew everything, The Briggs seemed uneasy. What was the matter with Briggs? And Rose, too, didn't talk. But then, that was natural. She never had been a talker. She had the loveliest expression on her face. How long after Lady Caroline's entrance?
What?
He didn't know. He didn't know anything. But the genial man on Mrs. Fisher's left was talking enough for everybody. That fellow ought to have been a parson. Pulpits with a place for a voice, by kings. It would get him a bishopric in 6 months. He was explaining to Briggs, who shuffled about in his seat. Why did Briggs shuffle about in his seat? That he must have come out by the same train as Arbuthnot. And when Briggs, who said nothing, wriggled in apparent dissent, he undertook to prove it to him, and did prove it to him, in long, clear sentences. Who's the man with the voice? Frederick asked. Clear sentences. Who's the man with the voice? Frederick asked Rose in a whisper. And the young woman opposite, whose ears appeared to have the quickness of hearing of wild creatures, answered, "He's my husband." Then by all the rules, said Frederick, pleasantly pulling himself together, you oughtn't to be sitting next to him. But I want to. I like sitting next to him. I didn't before I came here. Frederick could think of nothing to say to this, so he only smiled, gently nodding at him. It makes one understand. You've no idea what a lot you'll understand before you've done here. I'm sure I hope so, said Frederick with real fervor. The soup was taken away, and the fish was brought. Briggs, uneasy than ever. What was the matter with Briggs? Didn't you like fish? Frederick wondered what Briggs would do in the way of fidgets if he were in his own situation. Frederick kept on wiping his mustache and was not able to look up from his plate. But that, though he didn't look up, he felt the eyes of the young woman opposite, raking him like searchlights. And Rose's eyes were on him too, he knew.
But they rested on him unquestioningly, beautifully, like a benediction.
How long would they go on doing that? He didn't know. He didn't know anything. He wiped his mustache for the 20th unnecessary time and couldn't quite keep his hand steady. And the young woman opposite saw his hand not being quite steady, and her eyes raked him persistently. Persistently. He didn't know. He didn't know anything. Then Briggs leapt to his feet. What was the matter with Briggs? Oh. Yes, quite. She had come. Frederick wiped his mustache and got up too. Fantastic situation. Well, whatever happened, he could only drift, and look like an ass to Lady Caroline. The most absolute as well as deceitful ass, an ass who was also a reptile, for she might well think he had been mocking her out in the garden. Fool and ass, that he had come because he couldn't help it. While as for what he would look like, to his woes. Lady Caroline introduced him to her, and Lady Caroline introduced him as her friend, whom she had invited into dinner. Well, God alone knew that. He therefore, as he got up, wiped his mustache for the last time before the catastrophe. But he was reckoning without Scrap. That accomplished and experienced young woman slipped into the chair Briggs was holding for her, and on Lottie's leaning across eagerly and saying, before anyone else could get a word in, just fancy, Caroline, how quickly Rose's husband has got here. Fancy, Caroline, how quickly Rose's husband has got here. Turned to him without so much as the faintest shadow of surprise on her face, and held out her hand, and smiled like a young angel, and said, and me, late your very first evening, and said, and me, late your very first evening, the daughter of the Droitwiches. Chapter 22. That evening was the evening of the full moon. The garden was an enchanted place where all the flowers seemed white. The lilies, the orange blossom, the white stalks, the white pinks, the white roses. You could see these as plainly as in the daytime. But the colored flowers existed only as fragrance. The three younger women sat on the low wall a little apart from the others, and watched the enormous moon moving slowly over the place where Shelley had lived his last months, just on 100 years before. The sea quivered along the path of the moon. The stars winked and trembled. The mountains were misty blue outlines through from little clusters of homes. In the garden, the plants stood quite still, straight and unstirred by the smallest ruffle of air. Through the glass doors, the dining room, with its candlelit table and brilliant flowers. Nasturtium glowed like some magic cave of color. And the three men smoking round, it looked strangely animated figures seen from the silence. A huge, cool calm of outside. Smoke. Mrs. Fisher had gone to the drawing room, and the friar had gone to the drawing room, and the friar. Scrap and Lotty, their faces upturned to the sky, said very little and in whispers. Rose said nothing. Her face, too, was upturned. She was looking at the umbrella pine, too, was upturned. She was looking at the umbrella pine, which had been smitten into something glorious, silhouetted against stars. Every now and then Scrap's eyes lingered on Rose. So did Lottie's. For Rose was lovely. Anywhere at that moment, Lottie's. For Rose was lovely. Anywhere at that moment, among all the well-known beauties, she would have been lovely. Nobody could have put her in the shade, blown out her light that evening. She was too evidently shining. Lottie bent close to Scrap's ear. She was too evidently shining. Lottie bent close to Scrap's ear and whispered. "Love," she whispered. Scrap nodded. "Yes," she said under her breath. She was obliged to admit it. You only had to look at Rose to know that here was love. Scrap was silent. "It's a great thing," whispered Lottie after a pause, during which they both watched Rose's upturned face, to get on with one's loving. "Perhaps you can tell me of anything else in the world that works such wonders." But Scrap couldn't tell her to begin arguing in. This was a night for her. She pulled herself up. Love again. It was everywhere. There was no getting away from it. She had come to this place to get away from it, and here was everybody in its different stages. Even Mrs. of Love's Wing. And at dinner was different. Full of concern because Mr. Briggs wouldn't eat, and her face when she turned to him. All soft with motherliness. Scrap looked up at the pine tree motionless among stars. Beauty made you love, and love made you beautiful. Around her with a gesture of defense, of keeping out and off. She didn't want to grow sentimental. Difficult not to hear? The marvelous night stole in through all one's chinks and brought in with it, whether one wanted them or not, and brought in with it, whether one wanted them or not, enormous feelings. Feelings one couldn't manage. Great things about death and time and waste. Glorious and devastating things. Magnificent and bleak, devastating things. Magnificent and bleak, at once rapture and terror and immense, heart-cleaving longing. She felt small and dreadfully alone. She felt uncovered and defenseless. Instinctively, and defenseless. Instinctively, she pulled her wrap closer. With this thing of chiffon, she tried to protect herself from the eternities. "I suppose," whispered Lottie, "Rose's husband seems to you just an ordinary, good-natured, middle-aged man." Scrap brought her gaze down from the stars and looked at Lottie a moment, while she focused her mind again. "Just a rather red, rather round man," whispered Lottie. "Scrap," whispered Lottie. "Rose sees through all that. That's mere trimmings. She sees what we can't see because she lets him. Always love." Scrap got up and, winding herself very tightly in her wrap, moved away to her day corner and sat down to see. The sea where the sun had gone down. The sea with the faraway dim shadow stretching into it, which was France. Yes, love worked wonders. And Mr. Andal, she couldn't at once get used to his other name, was to Rose Love. It didn't invariably, as she well knew, transfigure people into saints and angels. Grievously indeed did it sometimes do the opposite. She had had it in her life, applied to her to excess. If it had let her an infrequent, she might, she thought, have turned out a quite decent, generous-minded, kindly human being. And what was she? Thanks to this love Lotty talked so much about. Scrap searched for a just description. She was as spoilt as a fish spinster. The grass doors of the dining room opened, and the three men came out into the garden, Mr. Wilkins's voice flowing along in front of them. He appeared to be doing all the talking. The other two were saying nothing. Perhaps she had better go back to Lotty. And Rose hemmed into that cul-de-sac by Mr. Briggs. Why, she got up reluctantly, for she considered it unpardonable of Mr. Briggs to force her to move about like this, to force her out of any place she wished to sit in. And she emerged from the daphne bushes feeling like someone, and wishing that she looked as gaunt and stern as she felt. So, would she have struck repugnance into the soul of Mr. Briggs, and been free of him? But she knew she didn't look like that, however hard she might try. At dinner, and shook when he drank, and he couldn't speak to her without flushing scarlet and then going pale. And Mrs. Fisher's eyes had sought hers with the entreaty of one who asks that her only son may not be hurt. How could a human being, thought son, may not be hurt? How could a human being, thought Scrap, frowning as she issued forth from her corner? How could a man, made in God's image, behave so? And he fitted for better things. He was sure, with his youth, things. He was sure, with his youth, his attractiveness, and his brains. He had brains. She had examined him cautiously, whenever at dinner Mrs. Fisher forced him to turn away to answer her. And she was sure he had brains. Answer her. And she was sure he had brains. Also, he had character. There was something noble about his head, about the shape of his forehead. Noble and kind. All the more deplorable that he should allow himself infatuated by a mere outside and waste any of his strength, any of his peace of mind, hanging round just a woman thing. If only he could see right through her, see through all her skin and stuff, he would be cured. And she might go this wonderful night by herself. Just beyond the daphne bushes she met Frederick, hurrying. I was determined to find you first, he said, before I go to Rose. And he added quickly, I want to kiss your shoes. Do you? I must go and put on my new ones. These aren't nearly good enough. She felt immensely well disposed towards Frederick. He at least would grab no more. His grabbing days, so sudden and so brief, were done. Nice man. Definitely liked him. Clearly he had been getting into some sort of a tangle, and she was grateful to Lotty for stopping her in time, at dinner, from saying something hopelessly complicating. But whatever he had been getting into, he was out of it now. His face and Rose's face had the same light in them. I shall adore you forever now, said Frederick. Scrap smiled. Shall you? She said, I adored you before because of your beauty. Now I adore you because of your beauty. Now I adore you because you're not only as beautiful as a dream, but as decent as a man. Scrap laughed. Am I? she said. Used. And the impetuous young woman, Frederick went on. And the impetuous young woman, Frederick went on. The blessedly impetuous young woman blurted out in the nick of time that our Moses husband, you behaved exactly as a man would have behaved to his friend.
Did I?
Said Scrap, her enchanting dimple very evident. Said Scrap, her enchanting dimple very evident. It's the rarest, most precious of combinations, said Frederick, to be a woman and have the loyalty of a man. Was it? Smiled Scrap. Man. Was it? Smiled Scrap, a little wistfully. These were indeed handsome compliments. If only she were really like that. And I want to kiss your shoes. Won't this save trouble? She asked. Won't this save trouble? She asked, holding out her hand. He took it and swiftly kissed it and was hurrying away again. Bless you, he said as he went. Where's your luggage? Scrap called after him. Oh, Lord, yes, said Scrap called after him. Oh, Lord, yes, said Frederick, pausing. It's at the station. I'll send for it. He disappeared through the bushes. She went indoors to give the order. And this is how it happened that Domenico, for the second time that evening, found himself journeying into Mezzago and wondering as he went. Then, having made the necessary arrangements for the perfect happiness of these two people, she came slowly out absorbed in thought. Love seemed to bring happiness to everybody but herself. It had certainly got hold of everybody there in its different varieties, except herself. Poor Mr. Briggs had been got hold of by its least dignified variety. Poor, disturbing problem, and his going away next day, when she was afraid it'd solve him. When she reached the others, Mr. Arundel, she kept on forgetting that he wasn't Mr. Arundel, was already, his arm through roses, going off with her, probably to the greater seclusion of the lower garden, to each other. Something had gone wrong between them, and had suddenly been put right. San Salvatore, Lottie would say. San Salvatore working its spell of happiness. She could quire than she had been for ages and ages. The only person who would go empty away would be Mr. Briggs. Poor Mr. Briggs. When she came in sight of the group, he looked much too nice and boyish not to be happy. It seemed out of the person to whom they owed all this should be the only one to go away from it unblessed. Compunction seized Scrap. What very pleasant days she had spent in his house, lying in his garden, enjoying his flowers, loving his ewes, using his things, being comfortable, She had had the most leisured, peaceful, and thoughtful time of her life, and all really thanks to him. Oh, she knew she paid him some ridiculous small sum a week out of all proportion to the benefits she got in exchange. But what was that in the balance? And wasn't it entirely thanks to him that would she and Lottie have met? Never else would she have known her. Compunction laid its quick, warm hand on Scrap. Impulsive gratitude flooded her. Much, she said, overcome by the sudden realization of all she did owe him, and ashamed of her churlishness in the afternoon and at dinner. Of course, he hadn't known she was being churlish. Of course, her disagreeable inside was camouflaged as usual but she knew it. She was churlish. She had been churlish to everybody for years. Any penetrating eye, thought Scrap, any
really penetrating eye would see her for what she was, a spoilt. "Why are you so much?" therefore said Scrap earnestly, walking straight up to Briggs, humbled by these thoughts. He looked at her in wonder. "You owe me?" he said. "But it's I, there in his garden. Nothing in it, no white flower, was whiter, more exquisite." "Please," said Scrap, still more earnestly, "won't you clear your mind of everything except just truth?" "You don't owe me anything." "I don't owe you anything," echoed Briggs. "Why, I owe you my first sight of, oh, for goodness sake, said Scrap, entreatingly, do please be ordinary. Don't be humble. Do please be ordinary. Don't be humble. Why should you be humble? It's ridiculous of you to be humble. You're worth 50 as me." Unwise, thought Mr. Wilkins, who was standing there too, while Lotty sat on the wall. He was surprised, he was concerned, he was shocked that Lady Caroline should thus encourage Briggs. Unwise, very thought Mr. Wilkins, shaking his head. Briggs's condition was so bad already that the only course to take with him was to repel him utterly, Mr. Wilkins considered. No half measures were the least use with Briggs, and kindliness and familiar talk would only be misunderstood by the unhappy youth. The better of the joy witches, could not really, it was impossible to suppose it, desire to encourage him. Briggs was all very well, but Briggs was Briggs. His name alone proved that. Probably Lady Caroline did not quite appreciate the effect of her voice and face, and how between them they made otherwise ordinary words seem while encouraging. But these words were not quite ordinary. She had not, he feared, sufficiently pondered them. Indeed and indeed, she needed them. Indeed and indeed, she needed an adviser, some sagacious, objective counselor like himself. There she was, standing before Briggs, almost holding out her hands to him. Briggs, of course, ought to be thanked, for they were having a most delightful holiday in his house, but not thanked to excess, and not by Lady Caroline alone. That very evening, he had been considering the presentation to him next day of a round robin of collective gratitude, be thanked like this in the moonlight in the garden by the lady he was so manifestly infatuated with. Mr. Wilkins, therefore, desiring to assist Lady Caroline out of this situation by swiftly applied tact, said with much heartiness, "It is that you should be thanked. You will please allow me to add my expressions of indebtedness, and those of my wife, to Lady Caroline's. We ought to have proposed a vote of thanks to you at dinner. You should have been toasted. So there certainly ought to be no notice of him. Whatever this is." He simply continued to look at Lady Caroline, as though she were the first woman he had ever seen. Neither, Mr. Wilkins observed, did Lady Caroline take any notice of him. She too continued to look at Briggs, and with that odd air of almost appeal. Most unwise. Lotty, on the other hand, took too much notice of him.
choosing this moment when Lady Caroline needed special support and protection to get up off the wall and put her arm through his and draw him away. "I want to tell you something," Mellersh said. "Lottie at this juncture, getting up." "Lottie," presently said Mr. Wilkins, waving her aside. "No, now," said Lottie, her aside. "No, now," said Lottie, and she drew him away. He went with extreme reluctance. Briggs should be given no rope at all, not an inch. "Well, what is it?" he asked impatiently as she led him towards the house. Lady Caroline ought not to be left like that, exposed to annoyance. "Oh, but she isn't?" Lottie assured him, just as if he had said this aloud, which he certainly had not. "All right." "Not at all, right? That young Briggs is—" "Of course he is. What did you expect?" "Let's go indoors, to the fire. And Mrs. Fisher, she's all by herself, trying to draw back, leave Lady Caroline alone in the garden." "Don't be silly, Mellersh. She isn't alone. Besides, I want to tell you something." "Well, tell me then." "Indoors," with a reluctance that increased at every step, from Lady Caroline. He believed in his wife now and trusted her, but on this occasion he thought she was making a terrible mistake. In the drawing room sat Mrs. Fisher by the fire, and it certainly was to Mr. Wilkins, who preferred rooms and fires after dark to be in there than out of doors if he could have brought Lady Caroline safely in with him. As it was, he went in with extreme reluctance. Mrs. Fisher, her hands folded on her lap, was doing nothing, merely gazing fixedly into the fire, but she was not reading. Her great dead friends did not seem worth reading that night. They always said the same things. Now, over and over again, they said the same things, and nothing new was to be got out of them. No doubt they were greater than anyone was now, but they had this immense disadvantage: they were dead. Nothing further was to be expected of them, while of the living, what might one not still expect? True, she crystallized and finished wearied her. She was thinking that if only she had had a son like Mr. Briggs, a dear boy like that, going on, unfolding, alive, affectionate, taking care of her and loving her. The look on her face gave Mrs. Wilkins, and she sobbed. Poor old dear, she thought, all the loneliness of age flashing upon her, the loneliness of having outstayed one's welcome in the world and being in it only on sufferance. The complete loneliness of the old childless woman who has failed to make friends. It did seem that people could only be really happy in pairs, any sorts of pairs, not in the least necessarily lovers. The pairs of friends, pairs of mothers and children, of brothers and sisters. And where was the other half of Mrs. Fisher's pair going to be found? Mrs. Wilkins thought she had perhaps better kiss her again. Mrs. Wilkins thought she had perhaps better kiss her again. The kissing this afternoon had been a great success. She knew it. She had instantly felt Mrs. Fisher's reaction to, so she crossed over and bent down. And kissed her and said cheerfully, "We've come in," which indeed was evident. This time Mrs. Fisher actually put up her hand and held Mrs. Wilkins's cheek against the of warm racing blood. And as she did this, she felt safe with the strange creature, sure that she who herself did unusual things so naturally would take the action quite as a matter of course, and not embarrass her by being surprised. Mrs. Wilkins was not at all surprised. She was the other half of her pair flashed into her mind. I believe it's me, positively me, going to be fast friends with Mrs. Fisher. Her face, when she lifted her head, was full of laughter. Too extraordinary. The Mrs. Fisher. But she saw them being fast friends. Or the others. Asked Mrs. Fisher. Thank you, dear, she added, as Mrs. Wilkins put a footstool under her feet. A footstool obviously needed. I see myself throughout the years, thought Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes dancing, bringing footstools to Mrs. Fisher. The roses, she said, straightening herself, have gone into the lower garden. I think lovemaking. The roses. The Fredericks, then. I think lovemaking. The roses. The Fredericks, then, if you like. They're completely merged and indistinguishable. Why not say the Arbuthnot, my dear? Said Mr. Wilkins. Very well, Mellersh, the Arbuthnot. And very well, Mellersh, the Arbuthnot. And the Carolines. Both Mr. Wilkins and Mrs. Fisher started. Mr. Wilkins, usually in such complete control of himself, started even more than Mrs. Fisher, and for the first time since his arrival, felt even more than Mrs. Fisher, and for the first time since his arrival, felt angry with his wife. Really, he began indignantly. Very well, Mellersh said. The Briggses, then. The Briggses, cried Mr. Wilkins, now very angry indeed. For the implication was to him a most outrageous insult to the entire race of Desters, dead Desters, living Desters, and Desters still harmless because they were yet unborn. Really, I'm sorry, Mellersh. If you don't like it, like it. You've taken leave of your senses. Why? They've never set eyes on each other before. Today. That's true. But that's why they're able now to go ahead. Go ahead. Mr. Wilkins, I'm sorry, Mellersh, said Mrs. Wilkins again, if you don't like it. But her gray eyes shone, and her face rippled with the light and conviction that had so much surprised Rose the first time they met. It's useless minding, if I were you, because she sobbed and looked first at one alarmed solemn face and then at the other, and laughter, as well as light, flickered and danced over her. And see them being a Briggses, finished Mrs. Wilkins. And at last Salvatore, and all the acacias flowered. No one had noticed how many acacias there were, till one day the garden was full of a new scent, and there were the delicate trees, the lovely successors to the wisteria trembling moves with blossom. To lie under an acacia tree that last week and look up through the branches at its frail leaves and white flowers quivering against the blue of the sky, while the least movement of the air shook down their scent, was a great happiness. Indeed, the whole garden dressed itself gradually towards the Enchanted. There were the lilies, as vigorous as ever, and the white stalks and white pinks, and white banksia roses, and the syringa and the jessamine, and at last, the crowning fragrance. Everybody went away. Even after they had got to the bottom of the hill and passed through the iron gates out into the village, they still could smell